Hello, I am Luis Simón, a professor of international relations at the Free University of Brussels, where I direct the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy.
And I'm Fabio Figiaconi, PhD researcher at the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Free University Brussels.
So in our recent Review of International Studies article, Better Safe Than Sorry, Why Great Powers Accommodate High-Value Hedgers, we tackle the question of how great powers cope with secondary states that have a high value and that decide to hedge. And by secondary states, we refer to those countries that are unable to provide for their security through their own capabilities and require some form of great power patronage. And by high value, we refer to those secondary states whose location or capabilities afford them the potential to tip the scales in a great power war. And by hedging, we allude to those instances in which a secondary state rejects to balance with the established great power or bandwagon with a rising great power, and instead decides not to align with either. And we believe that this is an important question, and also that the answer we provide in our article is somewhat counterintuitive. So within the question is important because there has been a lot of scholarly interest in the last few decades on why and how secondary states hedge, especially in a context of intensifying US-China competition. So for instance, we're seeing many secondary states in Southeast Asia avoid taking sides between the US and China. But there has been much less attention to the question of how great powers actually cope with secondary state hedging. And we realize that this is a big question that probably calls for a research agenda. And with this article, we just hope to contribute to addressing that broader question by focusing on a small but systemically relevant universe, high-value hedgers or war tippers. And we actually argue that great powers are likely to accommodate high-value hedgers, and that is because the likelihood and costs of losing a high-value hedger are so high that a great power will refrain from trying to manipulate its alignment preferences and run the risk of pushing it closer to the other great power, to the other side. So instead, we posit that the great power will accept and respect the secondary state's hedging position, which basically amounts to recognizing its value and its leverage. Our argument basically underscores the agency of secondary states and offers an alternative to the view that great powers are constantly looking for ways to manipulate the alignment choices of secondary states, whether through coercion or rewards. We also offer an alternative to the notion that as US-China competition continues to intensify, the room of maneuver for secondary state hedging shrinks. And we argue that the opposite may in fact be true, at least when it comes to high-value hedgers.
So we have proved the plausibility of our argument against two case studies, one historical, analyzing the responses of Wilhelmine Germany and Great Britain to Dutch hedging before and during World War I, and one contemporary, looking at how China and the United States are responding to Singapore's hedging today. Our empirical findings conform for the most part to our expectations. As for the historical case, we see both London and Berlin respecting the Dutch decision to hedge. This could be observed, for instance, during the diplomatic negotiations pertaining to the North Sea Agreement in 1908, where both great powers went to great lengths to accommodate and to signal to the Netherlands the respect for its position. Even when the war broke out, both were quick to provide a formal guarantee to respect Dutch neutrality. During the war, and especially in its final years, however, we have observed that both great powers, in some very specific instances, applied pressures on the Netherlands, when that worked in favor of the strategic interests of the day. Notwithstanding these episodes, however, the Netherlands overall managed to see its neutrality respected by both great powers throughout the whole war. In general, then, our argument about accommodation seems to hold in this case. And the same can be said for the United States and China vis-à-vis Singapore today. Overall, we see that so far both great powers are accommodating the island state's decision not to take sides in Sino-American competition. Just in 2 episodes, Beijing applied pressures on Singapore. Yet, also in those cases, China reverted to an accommodative strategy, an accommodative approach shortly after, and it is continuing to do so in the case of Singapore, even as of recently.
Yeah. So as Fabio was saying, our empirical analysis shows significant support for our argument, but it also reveals some limitations. So, for instance, while all the great powers under examination clearly embrace accommodation, some of them, as he was saying, flirt with abandoning accommodation and even do so at different stages and for different reasons. And that obviously tells us that great power strategies are dynamic. And here we do point to why there's a systemic incentive for them to be accommodating, but that is not the full story. So we believe that more attention should be paid to the question of when and why great powers may choose to abandon accommodation and try to manipulate a high value hedger. In terms of another limitation, we define hedging and high value quite narrowly and focusing on war tippers, but we also recognize that there's a bigger story at play when it comes to dynamics of great power competition. So, for instance, researchers may also want to investigate to what extent hedging secondary states that possess a high value in technological or economic domains that are particularly salient in dynamics of great power competition may derive similar forms of leverage to that we associate with war tippers.